All right, so welcome, and I want to thank all of you for being here. I am Dr. Amanda Reed. I teach some of the media law classes at UNC's Journalism School, and I'm also faculty co-director for the Center for Media Law and Policy. And I welcome you to UNC's 16th annual First Amendment Day. So for a more than a decade and a half, we have had this tradition of coming together and reflecting on the freedoms that are both essential to our democracy, but yet also fragile. These are the freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of religion, freedom to petition, and freedom of assembly. And this day is more than just a symbolic gesture. It is a concrete reminder that the freedoms enshrined in the First Amendment are not static relics, but rather they are living commitments that must be defended and renewed by each generation. And so a special welcome to my undergrad population. So this Faith Matters webinar brings us to the free religion, the religion precepts in the First Amendment, the right to believe or not believe without interference. And at a time of heightened religious and political polarization, creating space for dialogue across faith traditions is both urgent and healing. So how do we balance religious freedom in an increasingly diverse America? And to help guide us through this heady and heavy conversation, we have Dr. Larissa Anderson Horn, assistant professor in the Department of Communication at the University of Utah and proud UNC alum. Dr. Anderson Horn is a transdisciplinary qualitative researcher who studies religion as a digital and cultural artifact. I am thrilled to have Dr. Anderson Horn here to help moderate this panel, and I hand it over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Amanda, for that lovely welcome and for grounding us in the importance of this panel. I'm very, very excited to have so many amazing guests on our panel today. We are waiting for one more. Hopefully they will swing in. Before now, I'll start with some biographies of our panelists who we have, and then we'll move on from there. So first, I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Emil Lester. He is a professor in the Department of Political Science and International Affairs at the University of Mary Washington. He's the author of Teaching Religions, A Democratic Approach for Public Schools, and of the forthcoming Liberalism and Leadership, and co-author of a research report on religion in public education published by the First Amendment Center. Dr. Lester's work on religion and politics has been the focus of media coverage in the New York Times, the Washington Post, Politico, NPR, and MSNBC. Thank you for being here, Dr. Lester.
Thank you.
I'd also like to introduce you to Mark Chansey. Dr. Chansey is a professor of religious studies in the Dedman College of Humanities and Sciences at Southern Methodist University. He earned his bachelor's and master's degree at UGA and his PhD from Duke University. Mark studies the intersection of religious freedom and public education, particularly in regard to how public schools teach about religion. While many schools succeed admirably, academically appropriate ways that help prepare students for citizenship in a pluralistic democracy, Mark's research demonstrates that others teach about religion in ways that unconstitutionally promote some religious views over others. So his most recent publication is an article in the academic journal Religion and Education about Bluebonnet learning, which I think we're going to hear some about today. Thank you so much for being here, Dr. Chansey.
Thank you for having me.
I would also like to introduce you to Suhag Shukla, Esquire. She is the executive director and co-founder of the Hindu American Foundation. She holds a bachelor's in religion and a JD from the University of Florida. Under her leadership, the Hindu American Foundation has become a prominent voice for education, civil rights, and human rights. Her commentary has been featured in major outlets, including the Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, New York Times, NPR, CNN, BBC, and others. Ms. Shukla has served on numerous boards and advisory councils, including those for the National Museum of American Religion, YWCA Minneapolis, the Council on Foreign Relations, the Department of Homeland Security, and the Humane Society. She is part of the First Amendment Center's Committee on Religious Liberty and the UN Women's Platform on Gender Equality and Religion. She was also named one of the 12 faith leaders to watch by the Center for American Progress and honored by HHS in 2023. Thank you so much for being here, Ms. Shukla.
Thank you.
And finally, I would love to introduce you to Galen Carey, who serves as Vice President for Government Relations with the National Association of Evangelicals. In this role, he represents the public policy concerns of the NAE and its members to Congress, the administration, the courts, and the public. Before joining the NAE, he served for 26 years with the World Relief, the humanitarian arm of the NAE. Galen also holds the Master of Divinity from Trinity Evangelical Divinity School and a Doctor of Ministry from McCormick Theological Seminary. He's also an ordained pastor in the Anglican Church in North America, Diocese of the Mid-Atlantic. And Galen is the co-author of a book with Leif Anderson titled Faith in the Voting Booth, Practical Wisdom for Voting Well. He also co-authored Caring for the Vulnerable in Toward an Evangelical Public Policy, Political Strategies for the Health of the Nation, and Evangelical Catholic Cooperation in Public Policy in a book titled Catholics and Evangelicals for the Common Good. Thank you so much for being here, Carrie.
Thank you.
Galen Carey, sorry.
Later.
I am so excited to get started. So what I've asked our panelists to do is just offer us some brief opening remarks about the kinds of legal cases or social moments that are, sort of at the center of what they're thinking about right now. As Amanda has, kind of foregrounded us, there are a lot of legal cases that some of us who are familiar with the law may be aware of, others may be new, interesting to find out from you, and certainly a lot of political coverage of these issues happening right now. So I'm just going to ask everyone to speak about their expertise and kind of what they're watching in the news related to religion and the First Amendment. And I'm going to start in reverse order. So Galen, if you could give us our first remarks, I would greatly appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Larissa. So I want to talk about a case that will be argued in the Supreme Court in a few weeks on November 10th, the Landor v. Louisiana Department of Corrections and Public Safety. So this is a case that tests the ability of the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act, or LUPA, to actually protect the religious freedom of prisoners. Which is an important area that's often overlooked. So just a background. So in 1990, in a significant case called the Employment Division v. Smith, the Supreme Court essentially gutted a big part of the First Amendment's free exercise clause when they said that if government violates your religious freedom, but they have a good reason for doing it, it's just too bad for you. And in response, Congress said, no, religious freedom is important and needs to be protected. So a very broad coalition came together, supported nearly unanimously the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. Then a few years later, the Supreme Court said, well, no, okay, but that can't apply to states. And so in response to that, Congress passed another law, or LUPA, which is a sister statute to RFRA, saying that, in fact, when it comes to people in prison and when it comes to zoning laws, the federal government can enforce the religious freedom rights of both prisoners and of religious communities seeking to build houses of worship and so forth. So in Louisiana, Damon Landor, a devout Rastafarian, was imprisoned. He had dreadlocks, as many Rastafarians do, as part of their faith. Things were going well until about 3 weeks before he was to be released. He was transferred to a new facility where the warden ignored his explanation of why he had the dreadlocks, actually took the papers he was given and threw them in a wastebasket. Had him handcuffed to a chair, and they shaved off his dreadlocks, which he had had for almost 20 years, humiliating him and clearly violating his religious rights. Okay, so after peace, Mr. Landor sued the officials who had violated his rights, but in federal district court and then again in the Fifth Circuit, his case was denied on the basis that the prison officials could not be held individually liable for the violations. And in fact, if you can't hold prison officials liable, how else are you going to defend people's rights? I mean, it does no good to say, okay, well, don't do it again. Well, he's no longer in prison, but there's nothing preventing them from doing the same thing to someone else. And prisons have become very adept at mooting cases just by when they've shown to be violating a right, they say, okay, we're stopping that for now, and then there's no way to hold them accountable. So, appealed to the Supreme Court and will be heard, as I said, in a few weeks. And we're watching this closely because this will have a big impact on First Amendment defenses. And I'll just point out a couple of things about this. First, there's a very broad spectrum of groups that have come together in support of Mr. Landor. We and the National Association of Evangelicals joined a friend of the court brief along with the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission of the Southern Baptist Convention and the ACLU. And it's not often that you see these groups all together on the same side of an amicus brief in a case. So it's reminiscent of the broad coalition that supported RFRA in the beginning. And then secondly, this case is supporting a practitioner of a very small minority religious faith. Maybe only a few thousand people in the country, we don't know, have this faith, but that doesn't matter because the Constitution protects every single person, regardless of what their faith is and regardless of their civil status, if they're in prison or not. And so we're hopeful that this court is going to overturn the Fifth Circuit and establish an important basis for future protection of religious rights of prisoners, and that will also be helpful more broadly as well.
Lovely. So thought-provoking. Suhag, would you like to go next?
Sure. Thanks for mentioning Landor. We actually, at the Hindu American Foundation, also submitted an amicus brief in that case. So I've kind of highlighted three different areas, so I won't go too much in depth, but many of them are related. So one is 10 Commandments displays in public schools. Three states, Louisiana, Arkansas, and Texas, passed laws mandating that every public school display the 10 Commandments. And then there are 9 states that have proposed legislation: Georgia, Missouri, North Carolina, Oklahoma, Mississippi, South Dakota, Indiana, West Virginia, and South Carolina. And so the 3 states where the law has been passed, there are right now federal injunctions preventing schools from following through on the law until the constitutionality of it is determined through the legal system. In Texas in particular, there was a federal injunction, but some schools have defied the order. And so there's a second lawsuit, which either has already been filed or is forthcoming. And the arguments being forwarded there, at least the ones that we're supportive of, is that the laws not only violate the Establishment Clause, which prevents the state from endorsing a particular religion or establishing a religion, but also free exercise, that for those students who may not necessarily abide by the particular version of the 10 Commandments or the 10 Commandments at all, that it's a violation of their free exercise. So that's one kind of set of cases that we're watching. The other one comes out of Houston in the Fifth Circuit, DeBosch versus the City of Houston. And what's interesting about religious freedom is it very often intersects with or competes with other rights. Free speech rights, for instance, are inextricably linked with religious freedom. And so this is kind of an interesting case in which both of those First Amendment rights are being litigated. Mr. DeBosch is a Hindu, and he was arrested by Houston public park officials for having a corner where he was expressing his opposition to the unethical treatment of animals in factory farming. And the city officials deemed his messaging to be inappropriate. But Mr. DeBosch was doing this as a Hindu, as a reflection of his espousal of the Hindu concept of ahimsa, or non-harm. many Hindus who interpret that as also extending to animals. So the question of law before the court is that were his First Amendment rights, both his rights to free expression as well as free exercise, violated? And so we're keeping an eye on that. And I talked about Texas, I talked about a lot of southern states, and I don't want people who are in attendance to assume that religious freedom issues only arise for religious minorities in red states, because we're also dealing with issues in blue states, like in California or New York, for instance. So one case that we are actually actively involved in involves the California Civil Rights Department. This is the body that enforces the state's employment laws and non-discrimination in law. And they have made allegations against Cisco Systems, a major tech company, that two of their Indian origin engineers participated or were discriminating against another fellow employee on the basis of caste. In order for the state to put forward its arguments, it has made the arguments that Hinduism, it's defined Hinduism essentially as having and mandating caste-based discrimination, which it does not. And in order to make its case, it also attributed religious identities to the two engineers without really even delving into what their actual beliefs were, simply on the basis of them being Indian origin. Of course, we're against all forms of discrimination, but we're also against the state thinking that it has the right to define what Hindu teachings and practices are, especially as they are in complete opposition to what actual Hindu teachings and practices are. And then another, and I'll stop here, another area of the law that we're monitoring, although there's no active case around it, are laws or state legislators that are passing laws that define the swastika as a symbol of hate. Now, we have worked a great deal with our Jewish partners in raising awareness about the Nazi emblem as a symbol of hate, but the swastika, which the Nazi emblem is oftentimes mistakenly referred to, is actually a very ancient symbol, a sacred symbol for not just Hindus, Jains, Buddhists, and Sikhs, but also Native Americans and Zoroastrians. It's very much a part of our active religious practice, where some of our rituals and things like that, it's very common to draw a swastika. So we're working with state legislatures, not only in partnership with organizations and individuals that represent the Indic traditions, but also our Jewish partners, to educate legislators to not just deal with an important issue of compelling hate, or rather opposing hate with a hammer, but to take a more chiseled approach and to make sure that there are exceptions for those people for whom the swastika is a sacred symbol.
Excellent. Thank you so much. You've given us such a thorough a read on this. I would love for Mark to go next.
All right, thank you. Thank you. So I study the intersection of religion and public education. I'm particularly interested in how schools teach about religion, how public schools teach about religion, and it's really important that public schools do so, because religious literacy is essential, I would argue, to the smooth functioning of a pluralistic democracy. We're a religiously diverse country, and religious literacy helps us to understand each other and to cultivate respect across differences. And respect across differences is a really important civic skill that helps us navigate the American public square together. So I'm interested in how public schools go about doing this, and I would note that the U.S. Supreme Court has emphasized the value of public schools teaching about religion, how this is important for the sake of cultural literacy. What the Supreme Court has said is that when public schools teach about religion, they're supposed to present the material objectively as part of a secular program of education. And how to meet that benchmark is sometimes misunderstood and sometimes just simply not clear. I should note that many public schools and many public school teachers do a great job of teaching about religion in ways that are even-handed, academically informed, sensitive to diverse religious sensibilities, and they do a good job of shaping citizens to understand religion as a civic skill. So whenever schools, public schools, teach about religion in ways that don't promote or disparage religion in general, don't promote or disparage non-religion in general, and don't promote or disparage particular religious viewpoints, they're modeling a First Amendment approach. But sometimes that's not what happens. And Suhag has mentioned some of these occasions. Sometimes public schools and public officials play religious favorites. And when public schools privilege some religious views, they violate the religious freedom of all of us. So I'll give you a couple of examples. There are many, many examples we could discuss today, but I'll just zero in on two of them. One of the things I've been following is the rollout in Texas of new reading lessons for kindergarten through fifth grade that were developed by the state. And these lessons are called Bluebonnet, which is the state flower. So when the state education agency in Texas announced the availability of these new lessons, it emphasized that, hey, these lessons frequently talk about religion, but they do so just for religion's literary and historical value. So the state education agency really emphasized that these lessons are not for the purpose of advancing any particular religious belief. That's what they said. And the state said, a lot of these lessons, which again are aimed at young children, kindergarten through fifth grade, a lot of these lessons talk about Bible stories, but they don't do so in a way that promotes religious beliefs. And the state insisted these lessons as a whole are religiously balanced. That is to say, students will encounter in these lessons content, very odd wording here, content that would be recognized by those who practice Islam, Buddhism, and other faiths. So you hear about this, and you think, well, here's an opportunity for schools to teach about religion in ways that promote religious freedom. One hopes. Unfortunately, I don't think that's the way this is going to play out in the classroom, because the reality of these lessons doesn't really live up to the advertising. So, think about it. How does a public school teach Bible stories to children as young as age 5 without promoting the religious claims of those stories, intentionally or not? There are real issues of age appropriateness, right? Of when children are intellectually sophisticated, mentally developed enough to be able to even handle the idea of multiple interpretations of important passages. So that's a problematic aspect. As for the claim that these lessons talk about a variety of world religions, it simply proved not to be the case. Hinduism is almost invisible in these lessons. Buddhism, Sikhism, very little attention. Islam fares a little better, but most of the attention is on the majority tradition of Christianity, with some attention to Judaism. So no lawsuits have been filed about this yet, but I'm watching it. There's certainly been discussion. This is something that could happen. There's an ongoing controversy as districts discuss whether or not to adopt these lessons. The state is paying school districts to adopt these lessons, but so far only about a third of the school districts in the state have adopted them. The other issue mentioned by Suhag is Ten Commandments legislation. Those 3 states that have passed laws that would post the Ten Commandments in public schools, and the numerous other states that are debating such laws. So, advocates of these laws say that they promote cultural literacy, that the Ten Commandments are culturally influential, and so students need to know about the Ten Commandments. Opponents say that posting the Ten Commandments in public schools clearly privileges religion over non-religion, clearly privileges Judaism and Christianity, which recognize the Ten Commandments, over other religious positions, and looking at the details of the version of the Ten Commandments they want posted, actually privilege Protestant Christianity over other views as well. So It's hard for those people. It's hard to say you can post the Ten Commandments and say you're not promoting particular religious viewpoints, since the Ten Commandments are inherently religious material. As we've already heard, there all are court cases about that are making their way through the courts. They might make it all the way up to the Supreme Court, and other states may adopt similar legislation. So for those of us who study religion, religious freedom, and public education, there's plenty of business. Thank you.
Excellent. And last but certainly not least, Emil, please give us your thoughts.
Sure. Thank you, Dr. Anderson Horn, for including me in this event today. I'm not a lawyer, but a political scientist, which is much less lucrative. In related news, I'm a doctor of philosophy, but not the type of doctor my Jewish parents wanted me to be. So instead of focusing on one case, I was hoping to talk a little bit, zoom out maybe a little bit, talk about the political moment we find ourselves in. If my comments had a title, it would probably be Fear in the First Amendment, because I think fear right now is perhaps the major obstacle to Americans maintaining their First Amendment ideals. Many of us fear that if we recognize the freedom of speech or religion of our political opponents, they will only use those freedoms to trample our own. And the reason many of us believe this is because we've been told that we're involved in a culture war in America between left and right, secularists and Christian nationalists. I'm a political scientist, and I'm also old enough to remember those days and have the gray hair to prove it, when it was possible to argue that the culture war wasn't really a thing, or at least that this culture war story or narrative was greatly exaggerated by the media. This position was held by many well-respected scholars like Alan Wolf and by less respectable scholars like me. The scholars who argued this didn't mean American politicians really do or could get along, but the folks who argued this argued that just because American politics was hopelessly divided didn't mean that American citizens were hopelessly divided. So to use an analogy from geology, we argued that beneath the mantle of politics, the core of American society was solid. Incidentally, that's all I know about geology, so please don't ask me about anything else. I'm not sure you can make the argument that there is no culture war today with a straight face, as this position has taken quite the beating ever since Trump came down that golden escalator in 2015. At times, I've definitely wondered if we Americans had lost our solid core. But there have also been moments which reminded me that it's unfair to dismiss this no culture war argument completely or as hopelessly naive. Two of those moments came on back-to-back days over the past month. The first was an Economist poll about the Jimmy Kimmel affair. This particular poll found that 70% of Republicans did want Kimmel off the air, but only 30% of Republicans believed that government should play a role in removing him. Now, this 30% is still too high, right? But the good news here is that in this deeply polarized time, most people are committed to First Amendment principles, even when those principles conflict with their interests, which is exactly when these principles matter the most. The next day I was talking on the phone with a friend, and he told me that he'd be using a book I wrote for his class. This made me happy for a couple of reasons. First, because it meant that at least 3 people had read my book. That is one person in addition to my parents, although I'm not sure I totally trust my parents when they say they read it. But I was mostly happy because the book argues for a balanced teaching about religion in the public school classroom, and that teaching about religion is acceptable, but preaching of religion is not. Very similar to, I think, the type of argument that Mark is making. And the friend I was talking to teaches at a Bible college in Tennessee. He is a Pentecostal, a former Army chaplain, proudly identifies as a Christian fundamentalist and as a Trump supporter. Now, you might say that this case is very unrepresentative. My friend knows and likes me, which is very unrepresentative of people in general. The universe of people who likes me includes my friend, my parents, I think, and me sometimes. Still, like the Jimmy Kimmel poll, this is a reminder that people who disagree strongly about American politics can sometimes agree very strongly about First Amendment principles. The moral that I was hoping folks would draw from these moments, that I draw from these moments, is that, look, protesting and criticizing right now are incredibly important. And they are, of course, your First Amendment protected rights. If you argued, or some students wanted to argue to me that you needed to fight like heck against many of the policies of this president, I wouldn't disagree with you. To the students out there, please don't stop making and working on your fancy No Kings protest signs. But also, don't forget at the same time to talk about your First Amendment ideals in a positive way. I don't think there's any contradiction between believing the American government is a profound threat to our rights and our First Amendment rights right now, but maintaining faith in your fellow citizens, even many of your opponents want to protect those rights. And I'm willing to bet that if you do talk about your First Amendment ideals enough to as many people as possible, that you'll be surprised like me who and how many people agree with you. Thank you.
Wow, you have all given us so much to think about. I am so grateful to all of you for your really thoughtful remarks. I am thinking so much about connections between all of what you have shared. Namely, I'm thinking about intersectionality here. So like, Galen, your case, we're talking about Rastafarian faith, which is like deeply rooted in Caribbean traditions, especially Afro-Caribbean traditions, and in the American context, a lot of Black Americans practice. Suhag, a lot of what you mentioned about like caste is very like racialized, especially in America. There's also class, right, as a differentiator, maybe even gender. I would love to hear your thoughts on that. And then even Mark, this notion of like religious literacy for me brings up these questions that we're having right now in education about quote unquote, indoctrinating people with diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so like, again, bringing up this question of diversity in the classroom and the embodiment of different students in the classroom. And Emil, what you just shared as well is really getting me thinking about the ways in which like our differences intersectionally sometimes maybe predispose us to believe that we won't share equal values when it comes to religious freedoms or to the First Amendment generally. So one of the things that I've been doing, Amanda and I have kind of been talking through some of the cases that we were watching. One of them being this Pride puppy book case. So, this case of queer characters being represented in books in K through 12 education, and whether or not, it's First Amendment protection to allow parents to opt out of this. We also were looking at, I believe it's Oklahoma, where they're trying to implement a Catholic charter school, right? So these questions about like public education being supported by religious organizations. And actually just recently, yesterday, there was an article from Religion News Service about people who are protesting immigrant rights and who are feeling like their First Amendment rights are being violated. So I have this quote from Reverend David Black, who says, quote, "I absolutely feel that my First Amendment rights have been infringed and anticipate that there is a plan to do so more," end quote. And so if you're not familiar with Reverend Black, he's protested outside the Broadview, Illinois Immigration Detention Center for several weeks now, and they have been met with some fierce resistance from ICE agents at that location. So the question that I have that anyone can kind of respond to is, it's not necessarily just a broad, how did we get here, but maybe could anyone kind of contextualize for us, are there other moments like in history, movements that we can think of related to this intersectionality? Are there connections with queer rights, with civil rights, with any other kind of movements that we've seen over time that relate to these threads that we're talking about with religion and the First Amendment? Because I think sometimes there's a tendency to think that we're just talking about religion when in actuality, what you all have highlighted for us is how religion is so deeply embedded in all these other social identities that we carry with us. So anyone have any thoughts related to any of those things? I would love to hear it.
Well, maybe I could just say as a first response, I think all of the discussion has shown how there are so many messy aspects to how we live together despite our differences. And we can't rely only on law to tell us how to live together. Really, it requires respect and mutual respect and tolerance and giving space to one another. And that's something that certainly it does require law, but also requires culture, and even faith plays a role, because our faith teaches us principally to respect and love our neighbor, not our neighbor being not just the one who's just like us, but especially the ones who aren't just like us. And so I think that's what I see the challenge of this moment is, how can we move beyond our corners where we're just lobbing things at each other, but recognize that there's going to have to be some common sense, there's going to have to be some give and take, and not everything has to appear before a judge, or you don't have to call 911 every time someone offends you in some way, but there are other ways to work out our differences. I think we have, obviously, in our history, we've shown times when we have done that well as many times when we've done it poorly. But that's how I see the invitation before us.
Oh, I believe you're muted, Suhag.
Sorry about that. I think from the intersection of religious freedom, especially with other rights, we've been seeing a lot with LGBT rights and religious freedom coming across our desks in terms of signing amicus briefs from both sides, because as a religious minority, we find ourselves with strange bedfellows on either side of this equation quite often. Because we are a faith-based community. And so we will find ourselves with faith-based organizations, but then we'll find ourselves with secular humanist organizations. So it's an interesting space to be in. But more often than not, and I can talk about lawmaking, when it comes to religious freedom, or even in some of these cases, it feels like a zero-sum game. And I don't know that it necessarily has to be. And we end up in court because even the lawmaking process becomes this zero-sum game. And so one of the examples that Charles Haynes, who I deeply respect, and we're missing him here today, has pointed out is the Fairness for All initiative, which is in your state, Utah, where they've managed to, in key pieces of legislation, balance the dignity of people of faith who might have strongly held beliefs about marriage or about what their faith allows them to do in terms of creative expression, and the rights of LGBT people in terms of marriage, in terms of being free from discrimination in the workplace, or in education. So looking at ways in which we can have more nuanced conversations, addressing some of these issues where otherwise people who would get along all of a sudden come to heads because there's such a fundamental difference in beliefs, that we need to do more of that. And that requires, as Galen said, first of all, just looking to our own faiths and the teachings that allow us to transcend differences and to see one another's humanity, but also learn how to talk to each other and to be able to disagree without being disagreeable.
Yeah, Larissa, so I think if I could talk a little bit about the Pride Puppy case, Mahmoud versus Taylor, right? I think, as you suggested, this is a fascinating case for intersectionality, because you're dealing with the conflict of not a majority and minority group in this case, but the conflict between two, I think two groups that could be plausibly described as minorities, right, as vulnerable minorities. In this case, on the one hand, of course, you have the interest, which are incredibly important, of LGBT students and their parents as well. And then you also have, the plaintiff in this case, Mahmoud, is Muslim, right? So, and didn't want these materials to be in the classroom because they felt that, teaching them, especially at a young age, would violate the religious rights of their, of their students, and also their religious, their religious rights in particular. If I could just piggyback off of what Galen and Suhag was saying, and, Charles Haynes is not here in person, but he's certainly here in spirit. I think that I would just, affirm that the goal here is to, is to establish ways that these cases can be resolved before they reach courts, right? Before they turn into court cases. And so, to put this in a little bit of historical context, in the late 1990s, Charles Haynes mediated a dispute exactly over this issue, LGBT students, and their rights in the classroom. In this case, it was conservative Christians in a strongly conservative Christian community of Modesto, California, which is often described as part of the California Bible Belt. And when Charles Haynes came in to mediate this dispute, he met with, the parents of the LGBT students. He met with the conservative Christian parents. Not only was he able to get a resolution on this particular issue that all these different sides agreed on, but they also agreed to go beyond that and adopt what was at the time the only required world religions course in a public school classroom, which is a pretty incredible thing. I don't know if this is possible today, right? I don't want to say, I don't want to come off as, being too much of a Pollyanna. Part of the reason it's not possible is because, we can't clone Charles Haynes, right? I mean, I've often thought about ways that we could do that, but we can't. But one of the, just quickly, and then I'll pass it off, one of the common denominators that Charles was able to talk about to these various constituencies and parents and different groups in this divided community was that, for all the political differences that people have, everybody wants their kids to be safe, right? So, the conservative Christian parents could understand that the parents of LGBT students wanted their kids to be, safe in the schools. So how do we work, so that's a goal. How do we work towards that? And, the LGBT, the parents of LGBT students could understand that conservative Christian students wanted a safe environment to pass along their religious beliefs, which was, not, too intrusive on their religious beliefs. So, I think there are precedents here for those who, are willing to look at them and try them. It's not a guarantee, but, nothing in our democracy is guaranteed. So.
Yes. Okay. This is so amazing. I love this. I have one more question and then we'll give it over to our audience. If you have questions, please feel free to add them to our Q&A and I'll be able to ask our panelists here. One final question. I think a lot of students and other people who are in attendance might be interested in political communication, especially. And so one of the other cases that Amanda and I spoke about is a recent challenge to the Johnson Amendment, which allows nonprofits to take sides in campaigns. This was put forth by the National Religious Broadcasters Association. And it drew a lot of questions for me. Galen, you're at National Association of Evangelicals, Suhag Hindu American Foundation, and Charles Haynes, who would be here, is the Freedom Forum. And so I'm curious from all of your perspectives, both as people who are in maybe the academy, but also working in organizations. Can you speak to this moment in these issues of religious freedom and political organizing, or generally organizations and nonprofits, especially when so much is at stake with federal funding right now? So I'm just really curious about your thoughts and reflections on how religion and the First Amendment kind of coincide with these issues of political campaigning.
Yeah, thank you. That's an important issue. I think I would distinguish a couple of questions. One is what do religious people have a right to say and do? And another question, what is wise to do? And those are not the same question. So the Johnson Amendment turns on a question of what is allowable to organizations that are tax exempt, have 501c3 status, and so because that's the basis on which there's a thought that they could be restricted in what they say. The recent development with the NRB case had, in that case, the IRS said that they did not interpret the Johnson Amendment to apply to the internal communications of a religious group, what they call sort of a family discussion. So including if a pastor is talking in a sermon or writes something in a newsletter that goes to the congregation, that they would be, that if they did express political opinions, they would not consider that a violation. Now we have, in the NAE, we have surveyed our leaders of what they think about this. We asked the question, should pastors endorse political candidates from the pulpit? In our survey, 98% of them said no. That's not a good thing, and there's many reasons why that's not a good thing. Certainly, it's not a good thing for the pastor, who then becomes subject to lobbying from congregants and so forth. It's also not good for the unity of the church, because the church brings together people from different political persuasions, and the goal is that they should be able to come together around their shared faith and not be driven apart by politics. So do I think that religious people should be sent to prison because they endorse someone? No. And so to the extent that this it's not really it's not a change in the law, but this change in the IRS's policy, if it protects people from going to prison, I'm okay with that. But it's not something, we don't recommend to any of our members that they go down this path, because we think it's unwise for the church or for the community at large.
I would largely agree with Galen about that, because, I think there's, around the rhetoric around there was this idea that faith communities are monoliths, and they're not. While there might be one sermon or a certain set of ideas that are coming from the pulpit, it doesn't mean that every person of faith is interpreting them in the same way. And that's just on the theological front. But political front, you have people who are business owners, you have people who are laborers, you have people who are, physicians. They all are going to have different reasons that they espouse certain political ideas. And I feel that places of worship should be places of worship, places where you can transcend ordinary, mundane differences to come together and to heal and to be inspired. And so, as Galen said, that is it wise to do so versus whether you have the right to say so. I oftentimes say that you might have the right to say something, but it doesn't make it right to say. Similar idea. And so I don't necessarily think that even if it's allowed, that we should. And also, just from a minority faith perspective, you have not just a minority faith community, but one that is relatively new to this country. While there have been, there's documentation of people of practicing Hindus being here from as early as the founding of this country, it was like minuscule. We're still only less than 1 or 1.5% of the US population. And so you have language barriers, you have misunderstandings about what the law is, what it allows, what it doesn't. We've also seen a crackdown on, certain people holding maybe non-immigrant visas who are not free to necessarily exercise their free speech rights. So all of these things together would not necessarily put at least minority faith communities, where there's also an intersection with particular ethnicities or national origin, in the same place. So it would just further deepen political asymmetries. But setting all of that aside, I just think that I think it's okay to discuss religion and politics at the dinner table. I don't want to discuss politics at the temple, though.
Larissa, I wanted to return your question to this. Your first, I wanted to tie your two questions together and talk about intersectionality, because I think both Galen and Suhak have made wonderful points. I would call attention to the fact, though, that I think there's a bit of a disconnect between the way that the media talks about the relationship and the intersection between religion and politics, and how it actually plays out. I think the media story, if you pay attention, is, or at least in certain quarters of the media, is that the intersection of religion and politics is most prominent in conservative churches or in white evangelical churches. And actually, of course, historically, if we think about it, Black churches have intertwined religion and politics in many, many important ways, historically, of course. And the book I would recommend here, it's an excellent book for so many reasons, is Robert Putnam's and David Campbell's American Grace. And I forgot what metric they use in particular, but they found that, even today, Black churches place a stronger emphasis on candidate endorsement and involvement in politics for understandable reasons than pretty much any other churches. So I do think that this is a more, I don't have a particular prescription as Suhag and Galen do on this issue, but I would just call attention to the profound complexity of this issue and that there are a lot of dimensions of it.
Excellent. So I don't see any Q&A questions yet, but hopefully they will come in. So I'll take the time to ask another question. Emil, I also want to thank you for pointing to the intersectionality and the connection between both of the questions that I asked, because there was a Pew Research article report that came out maybe a year ago or something like that, where they showed that like more people basically said that Black Lives Matter has done, tremendous things for the Black community than people who said the Black church has done something for the Black community. And so I think this question of the connection between religion and politics and how it relates to how like actual, affiliates and members perceive the connection between politics and religion is just like vastly different. So I'm really, really grateful that you brought that up, because I think one of the last questions I want to ask here, oh, do I see a question pop up? Oh, okay. The CLE credit code will come up in just a few minutes at the end of the presentation. Okay. So the last question I'll ask here, and I would love to kind of popcorn it around and start with each individual. If you could just give us some like closing remarks on sort of the ways in which you see people who are practicing, people of faith. How are people of faith today? What kind of tools can you give people of faith today, but also people who maybe don't practice a religion? What kind of tools can you leave us with for navigating this really complex political environment? Some people in the audience, again, are students who are learning about these subjects, maybe don't have personal experience in these areas. Do we need more people who are in law and studying this? Like, how can we encourage them to continue to push these questions forward? How can we encourage interfaith dialogue, which I think all of you have done so well today, and something that we don't hear kind of happen quite frequently. So I'm also curious if you do engage with, people who are practicing clergy members, like sort of what's their reaction to this. So general question, I gave you like 5 different ones, but if you could just have any general final remarks on sort of, how you want to leave us thinking about the relationship between religion and the First Amendment in this really important time in the state of our democracy. And so I'll popcorn it around. Mark, would you like to go first?
Sure. Several things come to mind. First of all, I would emphasize we spent a lot of time talking about religious freedom and religious groups and religious voices. And I want to emphasize how important it is when we talk about the diversity of religious identities that we make room within that for people who do not identify with religion at all, right? So religious freedom also means the freedom not to choose religion. I do think that non-religious people, especially atheists and humanists, sometimes get a raw deal in American society. They sometimes are, there are prejudices against them. So I think we need to make sure that we have room in our public square for everyone, secular, religious, and if religious, of whatever variety that might be. The other thing I would note is that we've all frequently talked about religious difference and respect across religious difference. And I think it's important to emphasize that differences are okay and disagreements are okay. The problem is not that such differences exist. The problem is not that we disagree on things. The problem is when we're not able to show respect across those differences. So it's being willing to maintain our own position. Uh, uh, it's okay to think that other people are wrong, but we also have to find a way to live together and to navigate and chart a course together.
Anyone feel free to go next.
I can share from my own experience, but I think that it's important to keep sight of what binds us here as Americans, and that is our Constitution, and especially the Bill of Rights. A good way that for me has been, you know, picking which freedom is important to you and finding ways that you can learn more about it, advocate for it, and what you'll find is that there are people that you may not agree with politically necessarily, religiously, socially, but if you can find that one common ground, which is, hey, I think the First Amendment or religious freedom is a critical issue and something that's worth preserving and protecting, it opens up an opportunity to actually work with people that you may disagree with about on almost virtually everything, but you have that one thing. So I think finding that those avenues, those opportunities, maybe there's college um, clubs that are like religious freedom or First Amendment or free speech clubs. There might be other faith-based group clubs where you can learn about other faiths, and that gives you the opportunity to understand, like, okay, this is why I think religious freedom is important, because I may believe in what I believe very strongly, but what they're believing in is giving them purpose. They're giving them meaning. And you're not, it's very hard to then demonize other people or to otherize them when you've, had a meal together or done some sort of social service project together. But finding those opportunities to challenge yourself, I think that we have in some ways enter an age where we want to just be comfortable and we want to be in our own little bubble with talking to people or interacting with people that we think agree with us on everything. That's just not reality. Once you go into the workplace, you will come across people that you disagree with, or when you buy your first home or you move to another city, you will come across people that you don't fully agree with. So it's important to build those skills. On a college campus is a perfect place to do that and get active and meet new people and challenge yourself. That's my advice because it's worked for me.
So I really appreciate Mark bringing up the folks of no faith because I am a person of no faith. And so, I'm a college professor, so that should be pretty obvious. I mean, the two groups pretty much, overlap with each other 100%, well, 99.7%, I should say. I think what Mark says is really important because in the field of, religion and politics and religion and sociology, there was once a belief that the United States was exceptional when it came to atheism and agnosticism. That is, we in the United States pretty much, very large majority of us had faith or believed in some faith. The Western Europe and France, these were the places with the atheists, right? And, until relatively recently, that was accurate. But over the last quarter century, that is no longer accurate, right? I mean, the group of the folks of no faith are, the fastest growing, the fastest growing faith group, we could say, or group that has views about faith in the United States. The one thing that I would emphasize is that I think, and as somebody who, studies religion, is very interested in religious matters, not only politically, but also culturally and historically, you don't have to have faith to understand the importance of faith, or to understand the importance of understanding faith. I'm sorry, that sounds a little bit wordy. Which is, that to understand American society, right? To understand American history, to understand literature, you need to understand religion. And so, again, I don't have a particular prescription, but what I would call attention to, I think, is what Mark talks about, that, one of the fundamental challenges that we are going to increasingly face as a society, because religious, quote unquote, nuns are the fastest growing group in American, in the American religious landscape, is that, we need to talk about how to do this in public schools, right? I mean, talk about religion in a way which is accessible and fair to people of no faith, and is not biased against those folks. Thank you.
Well, I'll just add to these excellent comments. Speaking as an evangelical Christian, I am extremely grateful that we live in a country where people of no faith are welcome and free to not to have a faith. The last thing I would want was for people to have to pretend that they had a faith, or to be somehow pressured into it. Because as I understand, faith, religious freedom is a precious gift from God, and whether you accept it as a gift from God or you say it's a noble achievement of a democratic society, I'll take that as well. I think it's both. But the fact that throughout history we've seen various religious groups oppressing others, we've also seen atheistic regimes oppressing their people as well. There's so many ways that this can go wrong. But I think at our best, our Constitution and our First Amendment, and specifically our freedom of religion, gives us the best opportunity to have a society in which everyone can flourish and we can live together in peace.
Well, that is it. Thank you all so much for your comments. Thank you for your lovely reflections. I'm so grateful that we were able to share time with you. I want to give you all your time back, and I just can't thank you all enough. This has been amazing and so thought-provoking.
Thank you very much, Larissa. Appreciate it.
This was
Thanks for a
great.
wonderful conversation.
I would like to echo that. This has been a very stimulating and thoughtful conversation, and I am so pleased that we've assembled such a dream team. I could not imagine a better group, even with Charles's absence. This was an amazing constellation of thoughtful speakers with very generative ideas, and on behalf of my UNC students, I thank you deeply. Thank you.
Thank you, Amanda.
Thank you.
Thank you.